welcome to another LiFT session. It's great to see everybody. Some people looking very studiously engaged with various things, which is brilliant. We were just sat here having a cup of tea and talking, basically. So you've all been modelling excellent discipleship in practice by actually reading at things, which is great. Anyway, good evening and welcome. I want to say hello and good evening to Dinsdale. We're going to wave Dinsdale, but at the moment we can't see you, but we will wave from here. I'll zoom out. There we go, so we can wave. Hello, Dinsdale. Good evening to Tokoroa. Hi, Tokoroa. Hello, good evening to Waihi. Excellent, thanks, Waihi. Good evening to Vincent and Kath in Hawara, if you're with us. It's good to see you. Good evening to New Plymouth.
She's moved the other way now.
Hi, New Plymouth. It's good to there were quite a few of you not here last week, so we missed you. So it's lovely to see the cheery faces looking out at us. So good evening. Good evening to Morrinsville. Hi, Morrinsville. And good evening to Taumaranui. Hello, Taumaranui. And good evening, as always, to groups that are doing LiFT at other times in the week, to the group in Hamilton Cathedral, to Helene in New Plymouth, to Jan and Kathleen in Raglan, to Susanna in Kawhia, to Pip in Hawara, and to Pamela in Te Aroha. And also I want to say a special hello this week to Jackie and Christine and others in Te Kuiti, and especially in front of everybody doing the LiFT course, really to congratulate Jackie on successfully defending her PhD thesis yesterday at the University of Auckland. So absolutely brilliant that Jackie has achieved that PhD, and we look forward to her sharing her wisdom on her research with us in due course. So well done, Jackie. Right, so now before we get going properly, next week and the session after next week are going to be switched. Nina Simmons isn't able to be with us next week, so what's going to happen is that his session next week and the session after that are going to switch, if that makes sense. So just in terms of you thinking about getting ready for next week, what you're actually getting ready for next week is session 12 rather than session 11. Okay, so session 12 will come first next week, and then the week after Nira will be with us to take us through his material on bicultural relationships. I'll remind you again at the end about that, but that's just a little bit of housekeeping for that. Usually at the beginning of LiFT, what we do is that we kind of pause and take some time to debrief on last week's material, and of course last week was the put the bishop in the hot seat experience, which I survived, I guess, which was quite fun. But what I thought we'd do, just in this little few minutes to get us going, is there was one question last week that I wasn't able to spend time answering, and I do want to give that question some time, and actually it links in quite nicely to this evening's theme in our looking at mission and evangelism. So if it's okay, we'll spend the first little while on that question, and I've got something to read out in response to that question. But anyway, here it is. It seems to be that there is a strong vein promoting the importance of servanthood that runs through the New Testament especially. Given the busyness and often fragmented demands on us from sheer everyday living in this society, which can lead us with a sense that we are at times too stretched, can the bishop offer some guidance and advice on how we can fulfill this rich component of discipleship, keeping our servanthood fresh and joyously given? Fantastic question, and actually really relevant and helpful to thinking about tonight's material on mission and evangelism, because part of kind of getting into the orbit of thinking about mission and evangelism is working out what's our attitude going to be when we are engaging in mission and when we are taking part in evangelism. What kind of person, what kind of model, if you like, do we follow when we're doing that? And the servant model is one that is ancient, deeply contained and rooted in the biblical text, and is very rich as well throughout church history. And you will hear quite a lot people discussing servant leadership. And I wonder what that means sometimes. And I want to turn briefly to our friend, and I like to call him my co-leader really in this, Bishop John Pritchard. I almost feel like he's sat next to me sometimes because he's so important to this course. But I was reminded the other day of his sermon that he preached when he first became Bishop of Oxford, which was back in 2007. I just want to read out to you something of what he said, because it speaks to this question really, really helpfully. So he began his sermon by asking the question, what kind of church do we need to be? And in the light of that, what kind of bishop do we need? So what kind of church do we need to be? And in the light of that, in his context, well, what kind of bishop do you want to have? Is it an all-action hero bishop who identifies and fixes problems? Bishop as Superman, or Superwoman these days, a scourge of heresy. Heroes have a limited shelf life. They do not last long. The church is not in the market for short-term celebrity. We follow the crucified leader. The church is in the business of the long-term transformation of human lives. It witnesses to the unmanageable presence of God. It lives with and names the undertow of grace, which many experience and do not know how to name. The church is a sign. Is the church to be a saint of unvariegated goodness? A saint is a person who lived a long time ago and has never been adequately researched. The church may be a place where we can bump into a saint or two. We are all saints, of course, by virtue of belonging to Christ, but we often fail to be Christ-like. Neither of these images are accurate. The church is to be a servant, and we proclaim ourselves as Jesus' servants. How can a church do that in today's contested public square? How can we be servants without being servile? There is a myth of a shop where a lady was taken and was told she could buy there anything she wanted. So she began to think through all she had ever wanted and started to name her list. The shopkeeper, who was an angel, stopped her. Madam, we do give things away free here, it is true, but they are only seeds. The servant church gives away seeds. It offers wonderful creative ideas and beliefs and values. These are the seeds of a new world. There are the seeds of compassion and healing for the walking wounded. There are seeds of hope for those on the path of resistance to injustices. There are seeds of encouragement. And there is a seed store in every town and village in this diocese. So, how can we be servants without being servile? I think that's an interesting and important question, because it seems to me that what John Pritchard is talking about is the church, and therefore us within it as disciples, reminding ourselves continually that it's not all about us. It's about the one whom we serve and whom we follow, because that is what discipleship is about. And if we have that attitude, then inevitably that is going to overflow into how we relate to one another, not in a servile manner, but in a servant-like manner, because our whole orientation and being is in relationship to Jesus who calls us. And that is something that ought to give us overflowing joy. It shouldn't make us despondent or hopeless. It is an attitude that should always make us overflow with joy. So that's one way of thinking about this question. But it seems to me a really important question that we probably need to think about more often, because it asks us fundamentally what is our attitude as disciples. And it suggests an answer that says it's not all about us. And this is particularly relevant and important in the context of a culture that kind of is almost narcissistic in its tone, and John Pritchard actually points this out in relationship to a different context, obviously 10 years ago, but I think if anything, the it's all about me aspect of society has probably heightened rather than lessened. So as church, we need to be singing a different tune, a tune that can help soften, I guess, the hearts of those who think it is all about me, to remember that no, it is all about the one whom we serve, and therefore all about our attitude and how we relate to one another. So perhaps you could just spend a few minutes reflecting on that, and particularly on the theme of, or the question of, what is your attitude as a disciple? And if we can get that right, then that has a flow-on effect into our conversations about mission and evangelism, which we'll get to shortly. So if you just spend a few minutes reflecting on that theme, and I'll be back with you shortly. Let's crack on with this evening's material. We're going to begin by thinking together a little bit about where we are, literally, about what it means to know and understand place, the context in which we live and work. I'm going to begin this by a quote from Bishop Stephen Pickard, who's based in Australia, and he says this, and the word ecclesiology, by the way, is basically an understanding of what church is. So whenever you see the word ecclesiology, it's really talking about an understanding of church. To talk about ecclesiology is to talk about place, about God's place, about our placement in the world, about how and why our social life operates as it does, about what engenders optimal life-enhancing community. Within the modern disciplines, it is geography where such matters are particularly in focus. My concern in recent years is to see how theology might meditate upon the significance of place. In terms of Anglicanism, it has seemed sensible to me to ask about our place down under, about what it means to be Christian disciples in this place, about how our place has been constructed, and how we might understand the transformation of place by the presence of Christ in the Spirit. As a result, place has become the central mediating concept through which theology, ecclesiology, mission and ministry can be organised and better understood. This is more than an academic pursuit, as the deliberations of many church synods would testify. And I follow that quote by just a neat reflection on a footnote that Bishop Stephen then has in his book, talking about a reference to his own synod discussions about whether parish boundaries make any sense and are they helpful or not. And I was immediately drawn to a memory of a similar discussion that we had here in the diocese. I think it was 2013. It was before I was bishop, but it was a synod that I attended as bishop-elect. And I remember a debate on parish boundaries. So just a question for all of you to ponder for a moment. Do you know where your parish boundaries lie? Do you actually know where your parish boundaries are? Does this matter? Is a sub-question. It's worth pondering, actually. In some parts of the world, particularly in English parishes where parish has a really important understanding, on Ascension Day, church communities do something called the beating of the bounds. And that is an ancient rite whereby groups of parishioners will gather and they will literally walk around the boundaries of the parish. And it's quite a manageable walk because the parish boundary sizes are not huge. But you'll see a procession of choir boys followed by clergy in full clerical dress and various groups of people walking around towns and cities and pausing at particular points to acknowledge a parish boundary marker. And they will at that point take out big sticks and hit the boundary marker and say something like, well, mark, 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 just to make the point that they are marking out their parish boundary. Then they will kind of do a big X in chalk and then they'll walk on to the next one. Interestingly, in the city of Oxford, where there are some kind of overlapping parish boundary markers, one of the parish boundary markers happens to be in the women's lingerie department of a department store. And you can picture the scene of choristers, clergy, people, etc., climbing up the elevator, processing, through the whatever, to the boundary marker and, having a bit of a solemn ceremony. Very English. Try and imagine transplanting that into, I don't know, farmers or something like that. You might get chased out of the shop. But the point is, it is about acknowledging that the church carries a very particular understanding of place. And that understanding of place goes beyond the physical church building. It means that all of the people within an area are cared for. They have a sense in which they are connected to God and to the life of the church and to the life of discipleship, whether or not they go to church or not. So it seems to me that parish boundaries are quite important. So if you don't know where your parish boundary is, find out, because it's really interesting and I think helpful to a sense of place. So,
they're all set out in the parish boundary statute.
Yes, there is
anybody to understand it.
Yeah, so Canon Brian Bang is reminding me that this is all set out in the parish boundary statute, which you might actually need a PhD to understand, but maybe we need to simplify it somehow. I don't know. Anyway, that could be a whole other debate. But the principle is, do you know where your parish boundary is? So Bishop Stephen goes on to reflect on the importance, and he's talking a little bit about his own Australian context, which is why he talks about a theology of place down under. He's talking about Australia, but I think helpfully talking about the Southern Hemisphere, which is helpful for us. Particularly the challenges in the Australian context of acknowledging a colonial understanding of place. And of course, in our church context here in New Zealand, we've been quite intentional about understanding that post-colonial aspect of place in the way that we structure and shape our church, and particularly therefore the fact that boundaries are essentially overlapping, because you've got Diocese and Amarangi and the Diocese of Polynesia, which is everything, kind of overlapping. So sense of place there is quite complex. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as Anglicans we do hold our relationships to be a really important aspect of who we are and how we came to be disciples within this denomination at this time. Bishop Stephen talks about the importance of reconciliation. He says, colonial space is subtly transformed into ecclesial space. So this means that if we're really intentional about how we engage in a reflection on place, on where we are, then we actually have the capacity with God's Spirit to go about transforming that place. You know, if you know where your parish boundaries are, then actually you have almost a duty of care to think about, well, what are the needs of people within those parish boundaries? And how can we as church help meet and engage with that? So take some time just now in your local groups to reflect on these comments, on an understanding of place. You might even want to share with one another if you know where your parish boundaries are. Would you like to find out what difference would that make to your understanding of what it means to be church and disciples? And what does it mean then for us to assert that God is already at work in our community, and our job is to join in with God's mission? So it's not about getting people into the church per se on a Sunday morning. It's actually about getting out there and engaging in God's mission, because God is already out there doing things in our community. So take some time to reflect on that, and as I said, particularly, does anybody actually know what their parish boundaries are? So have a discussion around that, and I'll be back with you shortly. Everybody, hopefully you've had a good discussion on boundaries and place, to get you thinking about how we engage in mission and evangelism in those contexts. What we're going to do now is we're going to move on to look at the writings of three people that have written about different understandings of place, and reflect on some questions from that writing. So let's start with a New Testament scholar in England, based at Exeter University, Louise Lawrence, and she has used a lot of anthropological analysis in her examination of Scripture. You may remember back in the early LiFT sessions when we talked about the historical Jesus and the role of the context group, so that group of scholars that like to look at anthropological models to better understand Jesus' context. Louise Lawrence works within that orbit as well. So we're going to look in a minute about her writing, but I've just put this story down that I heard once. I thought quite fun, which is about a curate or a new priest working in Southland who is sent into a rural school to talk to the children, and he decides to talk about Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and he takes an image of Jesus with a sheep, thinking, easy, no problem. So kind of shows this to the children and says, you know, what do you see? Expecting them to all put their hands up immediately. But instead, the children kind of look at it with a real kind of serious glance, and eventually he gets exasperated and says to them, you know, come on, isn't it obvious? It's Jesus and a sheep. Whereupon one of the children offers the reflection that they were actually trying to work out which breed of sheep it was. Of course they knew that it was Jesus with a sheep, but they were trying to work out what the breed of sheep was. So I think that's a brilliant story actually about reflection on place and the detail of place. And disciples are really people that are called to notice the little details. Look at how often Jesus in his parables points out the tiniest of details. It's the smallest thing, the mustard seed, and that's a tiny detail. Imagine that. How well do you know some of the details of your community, and what might you notice if you go for a walk? Well, anyway, in an article that Louise Lawrence has written called Being Hefted, she explores attitudes surrounding people's what she calls their declining attitudes and relationships to their own place. And she defines place, and it's important to understand what her definition is, as somewhere involving a shared history, narrative, and most crucially, embodied interaction. So somewhere that you're actually involved in physically. So she then talks about places that are non-places, you understand that? Which is somewhere that has no sense of shared history, narrative, or physical presence. And she then embarks on an exercise of what is contextual Bible study, which really involves the sharing of stories about place. And she uses an example drawn from a study that she did in a Devon rural village in southwest England. And she says this: it turns out the word hefted is actually used of sheep, who have inherited from their forebears a profound sense of place, an inbred, inbuilt and intimate knowledge of their land. A hefted flock would never voluntarily leave its land, for to do so would be quite literally to forget who they were. From birth to burial, we humans exist in places, whether breathtaking and beautiful or austere and unsightly. These places contribute something to our worldview and development. Social scientists, geographers and psychologists have all variously recorded some link between who we are and where we are. Theorists tell us, however, that place is not a concept that should be understood solely in spatial terms. This place here or this place over there. Neither should it be understood as purely psychological, as all in the mind. Rather, place is a construction performed, reproduced and modified in practice, dialogue, shared experiences and stories. Lawrence then goes on to cite the work of another theologian called Tim Gorringe, who used to teach at Oxford, now at Exeter University, who talks about a culture of good placemaking. And what is this culture of good placemaking? Well, it is a body of knowledge and acquired skills. It is not bred in the bone, and if it is not transmitted from one generation to the next, it is lost. Placemaking always involves the empowerment of the people in the locality. They must feel their voices heard and listened to, for disempowerment perpetuates silence and social atomism. Third, a satisfying place cannot be made without justice. This can mean that each person, no matter how long they have lived in an area, what social level they are from, or indeed if they own or rent property, or find refuge as alien or refugee, must be viewed and treated as equal stakeholders in the sense of place and community. Fourth, placemaking involves either the recapturing or the creation of the charm of places, and from that the will to sustain them through specific practices. Attractive design and facilities for community interaction are essential. Finally, in Christian terms, that the church should be a placemaker par excellence, for it must always strive for the realisation of the kingdom on earth. It's a very powerful sentence, I think, and a challenging one. The church should be a placemaker par excellence, for it must always strive for the realisation of the kingdom on earth. And that's a sentence, a phrase, I think, that you can probably sit with for some time, to be challenged by, but also to see as an opportunity. How can my church be a placemaker in my context? Lawrence's example of contextual Bible study uses the parable of the prodigal son, which he talks about being as a story evocative enough to provoke a human reaction with or without a faith background. She talks about the importance of sharing stories, and Jesus' parables are quite effective for that, really, because they can almost be told without reference to their scriptural context, I guess, because they're good stories. And in fact, many people who don't really have anything to do with church or religion will probably have heard of the parable of the prodigal son, and it will often pop up in almost secular context, which is quite interesting. So the sharing of stories and narratives has an important role to play in place making. So spend a bit of time now in your groups. Questions over the page, top of page 12. How can the church help shape a sense of place for people? You might want to discuss this, obviously particularly with regard to your own context, whether you're in an urban, a rural or a mixed context. And then think about this challenge of Tim Gorringe, his claim that the church should be a placemaker par excellence for people. How can that be achieved? And are there signs of that in your context? So take some time now to ponder those questions, and I will be back with you soon. David Walker, who's the Bishop of Manchester and President of the Rural Theology Association in the UK. And the particular newsletter of that organisation, he wrote this: there's an old adage, and like all such, it's a massive overgeneralisation, that when a new person walks through the door of a suburban church, the first reaction of the vicar is to wonder what gifts and skills they might bring and wish to offer to the work of ministry and mission in the parish. By contrast, when a new person walks through the door of an inner city church, it is said that the vicar's first thought is about what needs they might have and in what ways they will be looking to the church to help and support them. But what about the church in the countryside? What is the rural reaction to a new arrival in the congregation? My hunch is that the most helpful early reaction is to see the newcomer as somebody seeking a greater sense of belonging not just to God, but to a community of others who seek to sustain their faith and practice through human fellowship. If we are serious about rural churches being missional churches, we don't need to wait for people to push tentatively at the church door one Sunday. We can be active in our villages, engaging with the people who show signs of interest in deepening their human belonging, and gently invite them to join with us as those who not only know their need of human belonging, but are not far from discovering the link between that and our belonging to God. Interesting. You might not necessarily agree with the particular delineations that Bishop David makes, but there may indeed be elements of all three in one, Trinitarian if you like. But anyway, a couple of points for you to ponder in your local groups then. So people aren't necessarily asking questions about whether or not God exists, but they are asking questions about how to live. Yep, so people might not be asking questions explicitly about God, but they are frequently asking questions about how to live. Example might be the current debate on assisted dying. It's not necessarily a question about God, but it is a question about how to live and die. So, discuss this statement as an invitation to engage in God's mission. How can we act that out where we are? With regard to the quote from Bishop David, do you recognise any of these statements that he makes about different contexts of churches and their potential responses to newcomers? What does that say about our priorities? Okay, so have a go in your local groups reflecting on those points, and I'll be back with you soon. Well, let's move on now to the third quotation, which asks us to inhabit and imagine an urban setting. This is by Andrew Davey, who's based in London, who has been an advisor on urban and community affairs to the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. So in this article he talks about urban spirituality. What is so different about prayer, spirituality in the city? How does the urban context affect the way we pray? And in turn, how might our prayer affect the environment in which we pray? What are the strategies and tactics we might adopt? Urban settings have not always been seen as a conducive setting for things of the spirit. The harsh anarchy of the industrial or commercial city has often been contrasted with the ordered serenity of the village green or cathedral close. Corruption is apparent in the smells, noise, pollution, and the visual temptations. Hardly a place to pray, rather a place from which one could cry for release. The psalmist sings of a direct correlation between the pursuit of communal justice and the built environment. The vision of the heavenly city stands firm against the pagan Elysian fields, a vast habitation where one can only wonder at its extent and inclusivity. The call to enter the New Jerusalem is one to participate in its maintenance and to practice human freedom in the presence of God. Pursuit of the life of the Spirit in the city reconnects us with that creative, communalising vision and energy. It enables us to celebrate and engage with the life of the city in our quest for the new ordering of God on heaven as it is, on earth as it is in heaven. So Davey talks a little bit later on in his article about how we've lost our ability to comprehend the spirituality that exists in the urban environment around us. Do you think that's true, particularly if you're in an urban setting? He also describes cities as places of possibility and encounter. How do you respond to that? And if you're not in a city environment, can you reimagine this question in your own context? See your own context as a place of possibility and encounter. How might we relate to the image of the incarnation in John chapter 1 with the rediscovery of the spirituality of place? So the idea that God tabernacled in our midst. And then, this last question, what happens? You all know the joke about what happened, and why did the chicken cross the road? Well, in this one, a priest crossed the road to ask neighbours what they needed. Crossed the road to talk to a school. Turns out that the school really wanted some land to plant a garden and teach the children how to work the land. And that exactly thing has happened. So sometimes all it takes is to cross the road and you will find new possibilities for engaging in mission. So spend a bit of time now talking about that urban context. And again, as I said, if you're not in an urban context, can you imagine your own place, your own where you are as a place of possibility and encounter in God's mission? How do you respond to that? And I'll be back with you in a few minutes. Because this next question is pretty important and we're out of time, what I'd like to do is return to mission and evangelism as specific words and topics for our discussion at the beginning of next week's session. So a bit like this week, we sort of picked up on a question from a previous session. At the start of next week's session, we'll pick up our conversation on mission and evangelism, if that's all right. So during the week, perhaps, as well as pondering and reflecting on some of the conversations you've had about place and about church as being a place maker, have a think about how you understand the words mission and evangelism. If somebody asked you, define mission and evangelism now, in a minute, how would you respond to that? And we'll pick that up again next week before we get on to thinking about theology and doctrine. Okay, so thank you very much for your conversation, for your interaction this evening. We're going to do our usual sign-off ritual now. I'll zoom out so you can see everybody here in Charlotte Brown House. We're going to wave and say good evening to Dinsdale, who we cannot see but we trust are there. So see you next week, Dinsdale. Good evening and goodbye to everybody in Tokoroa. And good evening and goodbye to our friends in Waihi. Oh, excellent. Bye, Waihi.
Another most enthusiastic.
You are, yeah, I think you get the prize for the most enthusiastic waving tonight. We'll give out stickers when we have our final celebration, graduation service. Good evening and goodbye to Howard and Vincent and Kath, if you're there, ka kite. And good evening and goodbye to Taumata Nui. You're literally moving all over the place, so that's really exciting. Awesome. You're definitely making yourselves known there. That's brilliant. Don't know if that's deliberate or not, but well done. That was great fun. Good evening and goodbye to our friends in Morrinsville. Bye, Morrinsville. And good evening and goodbye to all our friends and groups doing LiFT offline. Oh, wait a minute, New Plymouth. That's outrageous. How can I possibly do that? I'm very sorry, New Plymouth. Oh, you're not going to let me forget that, are you? It's because I blame Taumata Nui. They threw me by their exuberant camera action. So that really put me off my stride. New Plymouth, good evening and goodbye. See you next week, New Plymouth. You get a double wave. And then back to our friends doing LiFT offline, to the Cathedral in Hamilton, to Helene in New Plymouth, to Raglan, Te Kuiti, Kawhia, Haura and Te Aroha. Enjoy night prayer together, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Good night.